Today I'm going to be talking about avalanche safety for a new era. This is actually a recap of a presentation I gave at the Utah Snow and Avalanche Workshop back in early December of 2024. Before I go on, I want to thank my co-author and fellow researcher, Kelly McNeil, who did a lot of the heavy lifting and helped me with the analysis. Today I'm going to be talking about the golden rules of avalanche safety. Now, we all know these, right? They go like this: carry rescue gear, know how to perform a companion rescue, don't travel alone, understand the avalanche forecast, recognize avalanche terrain, and go one at a time. Now, we've all heard these. These are part of any avalanche education course. These are things you hear in the forecast, but I wanted to find out where these messages came from. I look back and the information about carrying rescue gear and performing companion rescue, the earliest I could find was the 1970s. Don't travel alone was from, first reference I could find was a book in early 1900s. And check this out, the recognize avalanche terrain. That advice goes back to the late 1890s. Now, these messages have been around pretty much unchanged since then. And the question we wanted to ask was, do they need to be updated for the modern era? We do know that something is working. Here's a chart of the avalanche fatalities over the last 50 years in the United States. You can see back in the 1980s and the early 90s, there was somewhere between 15 and 20 people dying each year due to avalanches. Today, it's higher than that. It's around 20, 25, some years as high as 30. But at the same time, what's happened to the backcountry? Back in the 1980s, estimates based on equipment sales say that there was about 50,000 skiers in the United States, backcountry skiers in the United States. Today, the number of backcountry skiers based on equipment sales is about 2.2 million. That's an increase of 44 times. Now, the fatalities have not gone up in that time, so something is working. Maybe it's better forecasts, more widespread forecasts. Maybe it's the availability of avalanche education. Maybe it's better rescue equipment. But one of the things that's been consistent across all this time is the use of these messages that come to us from half a century or more. Now, this is the fatalities that we're most interested in, these that have happened in the last 10 or 20 years. And what Kelly and I wanted to do was understand, are there lessons that can be learned from these accidents in the past that we can use to improve those messages? Now, what we did was we looked at 50 years of U.S. fatalities. We initially looked at backcountry skiers and snowboarders only. We're not looking at side country because of the different ways these recreationists utilize the terrain. And again, recreational only. We didn't look at any guided clubs or people at work. And we did two kinds of analysis on this. We did statistical analysis, which allowed us to look at trends. And we also did something called thematic analysis, which is a fancy way of saying we looked at the stories that repeated themselves in these avalanche accounts. Once an accident was investigated, often the investigators would put together a narrative, and in those narratives, sometimes themes, common stories repeated themselves. We looked at what those were for the lessons that they could teach us. Let's start with the first one, which is carry rescue gear. As you can see in the chart, it's not surprising. Rescue gear's been climbing for the last 30 years or so. Right now, about 80% of all fatalities involve some sort of rescue beacons. The avalanche transceivers are present. The stories that we heard, though, about what went wrong was sometimes people owned beacons, but they left them at home or left them in the car. Sometimes they left them in the bottom of their pack and never put them on. Other times, people had beacons, they were wearing them, but they had forgotten to turn them on. So if we wanted to update this avalanche message, this avalanche advice, we would say carry rescue gear and bring spares in your car and do a beacon check. So you bring spares in your car because we all have that buddy that one out of every 3 or 4 times they forget their beacon or their shovel or whatever. And a beacon check at the trailhead, so that's where you switch from transmit to receive, make sure that everybody is receiving when you leave the check. The other thing it does is it gives you some insight into how well your partners know how to use their beacons. Let's look at the second one, perform a companion rescue. Now this is the chart that we just saw, the increasing number of avalanche beacons out there in accidents. And one of the things that we found in companion rescues was that many times people had trouble resolving multiple burials, and they spent a lot of time trying to resolve with their beacon a multiple burial situation. In one tragic case, a person was so confused they actually went for help and left their 2 buried partners. So the other aspect of this that's important is the incidence of trauma. You can see that way back when I took my avalanche courses in the 1980s and the early 90s, fatalities due to trauma were about 25% of the accidents. Now it's 50% or higher. So one of the common stories that we ran across in our study of the accident accounts was that people dug up their partners. They were good at doing the beacon rescue, but they were not prepared to deal with the trauma that they found. So if we were to modify this one, we'd say, know how to perform a companion rescue. That is so important. But practice, especially multiple burials, and be ready to deal with trauma that's produced by the avalanche. And you could take a wilderness first aid course, wilderness first responder course. That'll give you the tools and the methods to deal with that. But that's so important because that's becoming an increasing part of what happens when people are caught in avalanches. Moving on, this is don't travel alone. The red line there is a 5-year moving average of how many people were killed while they were traveling solo. And this advice, as we saw, has been around since the early 1900s. But what's interesting is there's always a resistant group, about 1 in 5 accidents, of people who are traveling alone. And these folks telling them not to travel alone doesn't seem to be making any difference because they're always going to go out. So if we wanted to modify this, what we would say is don't travel alone, but allow the rescuers to know where to find you. So modifying this would be like, if you're going solo, be responsible. Choose a safer route. Share your plan with somebody at home, somebody who knows where to find you and knows where you were and when you'll be back. Wear a beacon and bring a satellite tracker so that people can see where you're at in real time. Now, wearing a beacon is not just about body recovery. There have been a number of cases where people have been caught in avalanches, solo travelers caught in avalanches, and somebody else witnessed the accident and were able to come and dig that person out, and that person survived, even though they were traveling alone. So wearing a beacon, having it transmitting, still really important. Let's move on to the next 3. Understand the avalanche forecast, recognize avalanche terrain, and go one at a time. These are risk reduction skills. And when we're looking at how well people use these skills, it's not fair to compare people that have these skills with people that don't. We don't want to put them all in the same bucket. So what Kelly and I did was we looked over the data and we divided the accident parties into 4 different groups. The group that we focused on was people who had taken avalanche classes and were exhibiting risk reduction practices. So these are people who appeared to be skilled. They knew how to make a plan. They knew how to choose a route that minimized their exposure. And when the accident happened, they knew how to do a competent companion rescue. That was about 56% of the parties that we looked at. Well, how do we tackle this first one? Understanding the avalanche forecast. Well, what we did was we looked at how many accidents of these skilled victims happened on tier 1 slopes. So here's a diagram, which most of you have already seen. This is an aspect elevation diagram. And this is what avalanche forecast centers use to communicate the most dangerous elevations and aspects for avalanche danger. So tier 1 slopes are those slopes at that elevation and those aspects that have the highest danger rating. So the question we ask is, how many of these accidents happened to skilled people on tier 1 slopes? And this is what we found. Surprisingly, most of the accidents, over 80 and sometimes 90% of the accidents, happened on tier 1 slopes, the most dangerous slopes that the avalanche forecast had identified by aspect and elevation. What were some of the common themes? Why was this happening? One of the common stories we heard was that people got together at the trailhead or on the drive up. They talked about the avalanche forecast. They said, yeah, I saw the avalanche forecast today. These are the slopes, aspects, and elevations that we probably ought to avoid. They chose a route that was going to minimize their exposure that day, but for some reason, they deviated from that plan and found themselves on the very slopes that they intended to avoid that day. So if we were going to update this, we would say, understand the avalanche forecast and make a plan and stick to it in the morning. Don't downgrade your plan because you saw somebody else ski that slope. Let's move on to the recognized avalanche terrain. Now, what you're probably saying is, well, these are skilled people, and even though they were being caught at a certain elevation and aspect that was the most dangerous, they were certainly avoiding avalanche terrain. They were just caught by a fluke in terrain that was not so dangerous. So we looked at how many of these skilled victims died on tier 1 slopes on an obvious avalanche path. That's a path with a clear start zone, a run out, trim lines, all the indicators of avalanches that a novice would recognize that as a dangerous trap. Above terrain traps, so these are above gullies, cliffs, and trees. How many of these accidents happened? What we saw was a rising trend. Now, these are the people with the skills to recognize the danger, recognize these basics of terrain, and over half of them are happening on the very slopes that these people knew were dangerous. Why does this happen? One of the recurring themes that we saw in the avalanche records was there were communication errors often among these parties. In other words, they had an agreement about where they were going to go, but the person out front breaking trail maybe got off route, took the group somewhere else. They ended up gathering up. Sometimes they didn't end up gathering, but they ended up in the very terrain they had hoped to avoid. And then they were just trying to manage a very bad hand. So if we had to update this message, what we would say is recognize avalanche terrain, know how to recognize avalanche terrain, but when you are in avalanche terrain, stop. It's one of the most important things you can do. Stop and have a discussion with your partners. Is this a deviation from your morning plan? Is this where you wanted to be? But most importantly, look at that slope ahead of you and say, what will happen if it slides? Will I be carried into that terrain trap? Will I be carried into those trees? Have that discussion and make sure everyone is on board with that decision. Now, one of the ways you can manage that is this final piece of advice, which is go one at a time. Here's the data that we found. Again, these are the skilled victims, people with taken avalanche courses that were exhibiting evidence that they knew how to mitigate the avalanche danger on the slopes they were skiing. This shows in recent years, it's over 50% of people did not go one at a time. Multiple people were caught on the slope. And they should have known, right? They should have been going one at a time. And one of the themes we found is that many of these groups did indeed try to go one at a time, but they failed for two reasons. The first is they misjudged safe spots, that the spot that they gathered up was chosen more out of convenience, perhaps, than an actual safe spot. So when the avalanche did happen, it overran that position. The second thing that we found was impatience. So the group sometimes gathered to the top and they said, all right, we're going to go one at a time, right? And everybody agreed. First person went one at a time to the safe zone. The second person would go. But sometimes it was the third or the fourth person that would rush. They didn't want to be left alone in dangerous terrain. They felt, oh, these people have already gone, the slope must be safe, and they hustled down, and having more than one person on the slab created fatalities, more than one fatality. In our data, this is about 43 people that died that didn't have to die if they had truly gone one at a time. So if we had to modify this rule of avalanche safety, we would say go one at a time, but study those safe spots. Make sure they're not bogus safe spots, chosen for convenience rather than truly being safe. And wait your turn. If you have a social agreement with your party to go one at a time, then really go one at a time, even if you're the third or the fourth skier. So what have we learned from these accidents? Here's 5 lessons. The first is that many fatal accident parties had avalanche skills. These weren't novices that were dying. These were people with avalanche skills. The second thing we learned is that these folks misjudged their ability to manage dangerous conditions. When they found themselves in terrain that they knew was dangerous, they thought they could manage it, and it turned out they didn't, and that's why one or more of their members ended up dying. The third thing we learned is that many folks failed to pick true safe spots, and they failed to go one at a time. And finally, they weren't prepared for the trauma that they found when they dug their partner out. The fifth lesson, I think, is the most disturbing of all of these, and that is that these trends appear to be increasing over time. Now, here's our chart again of the avalanche fatalities and the 5-year moving average. 420 people were caught in our data set. 285 people died. Now, each one of those lives lost is a tragedy. It affects family, it affects friends. It's not just a number. And none of us want to be on a chart like this in the future. Our friends, our family don't want us to be on a chart like this in the future. But I believe that the folks who have died in avalanches are trying to teach us something, and it's our responsibility to learn as much as we can about those deaths and what they have to teach us. So here's the golden rules of avalanche safety, updated again. You can read these on the slide, and this is one way of addressing some of those issues and hopefully prevent avalanche fatalities and help all of us come home at the end of the day, at the end of our ventures. Big thanks to the people who have collected accident data over the years, and of course the repositories at Colorado Avalanche Information Center, and the accident investigators and forecasters who over the years have done a stellar job of documenting accidents. And big thanks to the Utah Avalanche Center for sponsoring this video. If you need to read more about the research that Kelly and I did, there's a link below for our paper, and that's all I have, so thank you so much.